with, in thinking back to the 10th of September 2012, Facebook had just gone public, Kim.com was in and out of our courtrooms, and the iPad mini was about to launch. That probably seems like light years ago now. Me, on that day, I was on my way out of Auckland's Waitemata Harbour on a yacht with my husband, and we were heading for Ireland. We'd said goodbye to our friends and family, knowing that there was a real chance they'd never see us again. And there was a slight niggling feeling that maybe the skeptics were actually right, and this ridiculous venture would be our final act of stupidity. Over the next 12 months, we faced a number of challenges similar to those faced by teams in the workplace. This morning, I'll tell you all about those challenges and how we developed a common language to help us to overcome them. The idea being that maybe this is a technique you can also use in your cross-functional teams in the workplace to be able to overcome challenges that you face. It had all started 3 years previously when, in a rare moment of weakness, I agreed to help my husband Myles pursue his dream of sailing from New Zealand to Ireland. At the time we had that conversation, he had about 20 years of sailing experience. Me, I had 20 minutes. But I wasn't going to shy away from a challenge, so I signed up for sailing lessons, decked myself out with the latest sailing fashion, and I threw myself into this new sailing world. We sacrificed our holidays, we remortgaged our house, and eventually we had enough to be able to buy a boat of our own called Aisling. This meant then that afterwards we went to training courses on VHF radio, sea survival, weather forecasting, and we took every opportunity that we could to get out on the water on Aisling, get to know what she was like, how she sailed, what we needed to do, and how we could work together as a team to keep her afloat. One of the things that we even had to cover was how to function, how to get our bodies to function 4 hours on, 4 hours off watch. So you know what it's like when you're going overseas, or at least when we used to go overseas. Everyone had a little bit of advice for us. Some people warned us that it would be daunting, dangerous, even deadly. Most of them were talking about sharks and storms, but quite a few were talking about the sheer horror of being locked up, cooped up for that long in a confined space with your other half. We listened with respect. And then we thought about the crystal clear waters of French Polynesia and the cocktails on board in the Caribbean. And we figured we'd take our chances. Now, you may be wondering what, if anything, this has to do with cross-functional teams in the workplace. Well, in many ways, our trip was very similar to a project that we all are involved with on a daily basis. To start with, clearing customs was our team kickoff. Was the project kickoff. Every day we had a stand-up or a check-in at lunchtime, which was the one time we were both awake at the same time, to see how much progress we'd made in the last 24 hours and how much more what we needed to do to keep us on track for the next 24. We even ran a pilot. The previous Christmas, we'd sailed from Auckland to Tauranga and back. And we had some of that great user feedback that we always seek for in a pilot when we ran aground on the sandbar at Whangamata Harbour on New Year's Eve in front of a beach full of spectators. In fact, our trip from New Zealand to Ireland was so much like one of our everyday projects in the workplace that within just 5 days of departing, we faced a challenge that many of us face today. We were just out of sight of the New Zealand coastline when our requirements changed. Strong winds arrived from the Antarctic, bringing big waves and freezing temperatures. From Aisling's perspective, it was a dream start to the voyage, and she powered on through the waves towards our destination, Tahiti. For us, the crew inside, we were initially positive, excited, even a little bit kind of exhilarated by the fact that we'd get to put all of our training and knowledge into practice so early in the piece. However, it wasn't long before the changes on the outside increased the pressure for us on the inside. And it wasn't so much a dream, a lot more like a nightmare. You see, We were already exhausted from weeks and months of late nights planning this adventure, in addition to working 2 full-time jobs. Then, when the waves and the freezing temperatures hit, we were spending every waking moment wedged in a corner of a damp and humid cabin, bracing for an impact that could come at any moment. Simple things like making a cup of tea took about 20 minutes. Open the cupboard, take out the tea, put back everything else that had fallen out when you opened the cupboard, and close the cupboard. And then you repeat for milk, and yes, we take sugar, and don't get me talking about the boiling water. Even going to the toilet was an adventure in itself. If you failed to brace, a perfectly timed wave would catapult you off the bowl and into a closet. Swapping shifts in the middle of one particularly stormy night, Myles instructed me to keep watch and keep the wind 45 degrees to starboard. I duly listened and did what I was told, and an hour later, I was so delighted to see that our speed had almost doubled. I couldn't wait for him to wake up and see that I had made this great contribution to our project. Maybe I actually could be a sailor after all. Maybe not. Myles woke and joined in my excitement that we were starting to pick up speed. But then he checked the charts and the equipment and realized that the wind had changed while I was on watch, and my lack of knowledge had sailed us for 3 hours very fast in the wrong direction. Have you ever worked on a project where the apprentice or the novice derailed the project inadvertently and set you back 6 precious hours or days? This was just one of several situations that made me feel a bit useless and out of my depth. Myles had thrown himself into facts and figures to find a smoother route or a calmer patch of sea. As the project manager equivalent, I could only do what I was told and find ways to weather the storm by myself. The hours passed and the bruises increased, and slowly Myles and I drifted apart to become 2 desert islands within one very small boat. I felt rejected after multiple failed attempts to help, and I ground to a halt and I guess checked out, leaving 100% of the work to Myles. I didn't get off the boat physically, it wasn't really an option, but I certainly did emotionally, and I made sure he knew about it too. I ridiculed the global sailing community, how sadistic they were to be able to get pleasure from situations and conditions like this. I accused Myles of trickery and deception and not preparing us enough to be able to deal with these circumstances. And I slept during my watch, a big no-no, and refused to do any of my chores. Myles listened. He did his chores. He did mine too, and went back to the books. Now, all along this, while this was happening, the yacht still kept going and the project was still on track, but we were quickly gathering collateral damage in the form of staff morale. Now, bear in mind that we were in this situation and facing this challenge with what I'd call 10 years of a healthy relationship behind us. In today's workplace, people are expected to work together and overcome challenges with a lot less history behind them. So if Myles and I prepared and practiced and still failed to function as a team under pressure, it's not really surprising that our workplace teams don't always click. Like when a project appears to be on track, but it's because it's still technically moving forward, but the technical team members look blankly at the business representative because they don't understand the acronyms or jargon that she uses when talking to them. Or if content creation is behind schedule because a subject matter expert insists on describing the product by email in short bullet points rather than make time for a face-to-face briefing. Or if the team members avoid project meetings because there's no set agenda or agreed actions. It's easy to spot people who physically check out of your project. They arrive late, they call in sick a lot, eventually they may leave. But when people emotionally check out, you can't always be guaranteed the highly verbal performance like mine on board Ashling. It may look more like people being quieter than usual in meetings or shrugging their shoulders when it comes to making a decision. Spotting a communication problem takes time and effort and attention. Back in our struggling cross-functional project, 1,000 miles from land in the South Pacific, we were sailing, but we weren't speaking. How could this happen after all of that training and preparation? But I guess Myles and I weren't working as a team, not because of a failing in our technical knowledge or frameworks or processes. It was because we were speaking different languages and we were both under a lot of pressure. You see, Myles is a technical person, a specialist. Whether it's software engineering, following a recipe for dinner, or sailing, he's thorough, detailed, and precise. When he communicates analytically. Me, I'm more of a generalist, not so thorough. Detail is boring, and done is better than perfect. My thinking and communication style is a lot more consultative or exploratory. To give you an example, I describe our adventure as sailing around the world, but Myles will always make sure to mention that it was only halfway. Under pressure, Myles goes solo and he dives into the detail. He's convinced he'll find an answer to any problem in knowledge. That's why he was silently channeling his inner Peter Blake to get us through the difficult situation, the difficult circumstances, and get to Tahiti. When I'm under pressure, I surround myself with people. We talk through the problem until we make a plan. If there's no conversation, if there's no plan, then I lose confidence that the end result is even worth the effort. That's why I was mouthing off and going on strike and giving up on our goal. Without luck or a particularly astute recruiter, workplace teams are just as susceptible to these type of language differences, especially when they're under pressure. Any given person processes information in one of 4 different ways. Any given person behaves in one of 4 different ways in its specific situation. And when it comes to language skills in the workplace, any given person has one of 4 different levels of proficiency. So if you consider this, with a team of 5, your average Scrum team, you have 320 permutations of communication. Now I'd like you to think about your team. If it's a cross-functional team, you'll be working with people who are not the same in the same discipline as you. Maybe you're working with engineers or QA or marketing or even support. In our business, Wires Uncrossed, we work with many cross-functional teams like these to help them navigate their language differences. Sometimes it's these 320 permutations of communication that's the issue. Or it can be a leadership problem. See, from an organization perspective, leaders are often blinkered about how much effort is really needed to create a successful cross-functional team. Many assume that a solid foundation is already in place around ways of working and communicating. So leaders don't need to take action to front-foot communication challenges that they face. But those challenges happen just simply because people aren't used to working with one another. It's a new team, it's a new group of teams, somebody's left, somebody's joined, the dynamic changes. And each of those situations requires a reset in terms of what language and what is the common language to ensure successful performance of that team. In our current world of processes and rituals, it's easy to assume that roles, a process, a ritual is simply enough to connect a team, but it's not. Other issues that can happen in these cross-functional teams is where there's historical baggage. Like for decades, there's been a tension between technology teams and those teams across the rest of an organization who neither understand or have a lot of respect for one another. Technology can often be treated like a second-class citizen that is there just to deliver on requests that come from outside their team. And in some cases, the technology teams are used to this, so they behave, they fill that role, as that second-class citizen because it's familiar territory and they don't have experience of challenging that situation. But how can people work effectively in a cross-functional team if they don't see eye to eye? Without help at the start, many teams work out their optimum way of communicating by trial and error, project by project. To start with, everyone is enthusiastic and positive about reaching the end goal. They're visualizing their arrival at the port at Tahiti like us, and they trust that their optimism and enthusiasm is enough to keep the yacht afloat. They're also blindly unaware of how different their languages are. A storm hits, like a deadline's brought forward or something doesn't happen on time like it was planned. And the team spends more time than they should repeating themselves, discovering misunderstandings, and redoing work. They don't have time to see that a developer communicates better in writing than verbally, or that a salesperson is being uncooperative because they don't understand the team's technical jargon, or that another person prioritizes accuracy over urgency. It's precisely the worst time for them to figure out each other's languages. What happens? Creativity goes through the floor because people are tired. Meetings are tense because people are in defense mode. Micromanagement creeps in and exacerbates the problem. With these issues on board, the team at best will compromise the quality of the project. At worst, they miss the objective and the deadline. Either way, there's collateral damage in terms of team morale from stressful working conditions or personality conflicts, or even just because they're working longer hours. For disconnected cross-functional teams, there's relief at least at the end of the day when you get to leave the office and escape the pressure cooker for 8 or 12 hours. But on board Ashling, there was no such escape, and we had no choice but to find a way to connect. Arriving in Tahiti, that started because the tables turned when the captain found himself navigating the choppy waters of French bureaucracy in English. He handed this very important job over to the first mate, which went against all nautical protocol. But what I lacked in nautical understanding, I made up for in French speaking, and we soon sailed through the formalities. Now that might sound insignificant, but it was a major shift for us in terms of our of how we worked together as a team, because it changed who was on point for a particular piece of work. After 3 weeks of feeling useless or like a burden or that I simply didn't belong to this team, I felt useful and needed. Myles felt a weight leave his shoulders and was grateful for somebody else to take the lead. We both went from feeling alone to feeling like part of a team at last. The post-implementation review or retrospective, that lasted a whole week. There was a lot of talk, there were tears, and there was also quite a lot of wine. Well, it's French Polynesia after all. As the physical and emotional bruising subsided, we switched from me to we, and we found the source of our problem. We couldn't change our crew. We certainly couldn't control the weather, and we couldn't change the yacht. But what we could change was the way that we communicated, and so we developed our common language. Now, a common language for us, this wasn't so much about the words we used and whether we said kitchen or galley. It was more of an agreed way of communicating verbally and non-verbally. Like what we said, so what we said mattered more, just as much, if anything, as how we said it, when we said it. And sometimes it was about not saying anything at all when somebody said kitchen instead of galley. It also meant communicating through gestures, like showing respect and appreciation for our fellow team member. Like when Myles would tell me about a problem, even if he didn't need my help to solve it. Knowing that that was on his mind was enough for me to know why he was distracted or had his head stuck in a book. Or to counter the imbalance from one of us being more technically skilled, every day we'd play a game of cards because that was something we were both equally capable of doing. Or when one of us was struggling physically or emotionally, we took turns to shoulder the load because both of us couldn't have a pity party at the same time. Now, at this stage, you might be expecting a slide advertising a ready-made common language for cross-functional teams at a very attractive price. That's not going to happen. Because just as there was no one common language for us to add to our Burnsko shopping cart for our sailing adventure, there's no one common language that works for every team. The common language for Myles and I reflects our personalities. Myles' technical focus, my generalist tendency, our upbringing and Celtic heritage, our 10-year history together, and the scar tissue that was created on that nightmare trip from Auckland to Tahiti. Every team will have a different combination of thinking styles, of communication styles, of cultural mix and backgrounds. And this means that every team needs to figure out their own common language. Now, I appreciate that going to your boss to ask him to sail your team through a storm to Tahiti and then spend a week on a tropical island to find your common language might be a tall order. There is, however, a more comfortable and quicker way to do it, and that's by staying on dry land. And since our return to New Zealand, we've worked with a number of teams to help them to find and develop their common language. Some were environmental scientists at a manufacturing company, or agile teams in technology startups, or even a data team in a multinational. And 4 common things stand out from how they found their common language. The first was to share their languages. Everyone in the team identifies their thinking style, their communication style, how they communicate verbally, how they do that non-verbally. And then they find out how their teammates compare. Are they analytical like Myles, or more generalist consultative like me? Someone like a project manager or a team lead or team leader arranges these introductions, icebreakers, personality profiling assessments, and makes sure that those are the activities are the ones that are appropriate for the team and the context. The second is to acquire scar tissue. It's important that a team shares an experience under pressure before it happens for real, like us running into the sandbar in Whangamata Harbour. Orchestrating a pressurized situation near the start of a project really helps, like maybe even simple things. Tell the team they can't work in Chrome for the day if that's something that they do a lot. And afterwards, follow it up with a debrief to call out what worked and what didn't work from a communication perspective. Then agree how you can communicate when you're under pressure. The third thing is to investigate the tough times. Talking, crying, and drinking wine helped us to figure out where we'd gone so horribly wrong. And a strong and honest review after a project often provides a key to what is holding the team back from its common language. This might not be something you do, this could be something you do anonymously through a survey, or if the team is strong enough to have those conversations, to have it in person. But reviewing what had happened and what you liked, what you didn't like, what worked, what didn't work, is all part of being able to find what your common language is. And then learning by doing. So the best of intentions and planning will only be realized when you actually start. Learn, build, measure, talk regularly about how you communicate as a team at regular stages of your project. Thanks to our common language, the first leg of our adventure was at polar opposites to later legs through the rest of the Pacific, the Panama Canal, and across the Atlantic until we eventually reached Ireland. Don't get me wrong, it was far from plain sailing. Just before Christmas, a key piece of equipment broke on the boat. If anyone's on the call as a sailor, this was our forestay. And it was in another remote part of the Pacific Ocean. That ocean is quite big. And it happened just 4 days before Christmas. This meant that the boat slowed down and we would likely run out of food well before reaching land. And just like a Hollywood movie, it didn't end there. Our slow speed meant that we gathered little creatures called gooseneck barnacles on the hull of the boat, which slowed us down even more. Then 50 miles from the coast of Panama, we ran out of fuel. But instead of falling apart like we would have done at the start of our journey, we managed to work together as a crew because we had our common language. We discussed all our options, made a plan, and stuck to it. And eventually we reached land with the help of the Panama Coast Guard. Transiting the Panama Canal, we faced a complex journey that involved ships, locks, and bureaucracy. Without our common language, this would have spelled disaster as we faced physical and financial risks at every turn. But our common language meant we worked to our strengths. We always knew what was happening, and we had a smooth passage. When we crossed the Atlantic, I think our spoken word count dropped by about 50% because there was now so much we didn't need to say. It felt more like a holiday than an ocean crossing. Discovering a common language helped Myles and I to get to the other side of the world with our lives, sanity, and relationships still very much intact. It didn't just help us to cope with the tough times, it set us up to achieve more with less, more in less time, and with more enjoyment. Today, we're well and truly settled back on dry land, but in moments of pressure, we still revert to our common language. As a couple, as parents, as business partners, we get clear on what we're trying to achieve and how we'll each individually contribute to achieving it. We quickly spot miscommunication and misunderstandings, and we now laugh about our different communication and thinking styles as we use them to resolve a disagreement or at least lighten the mood. For teams in the workplace, discovering a common language has benefits for both the individual and the team. An individual feels accepted and respected and appreciated by their team, and in moments of pressure, they will seek to protect the unit and their teammates. The team hums through their work, they act as one, and generally they communicate more through nonverbal than through words. Just as the vast ocean showed Myles and I that we could overcome our communication challenges, I hope that our experience shows you that your cross-functional team can do this too. So rock the boat. Help your team to find their common language so you can weather stormy conditions and spend more time plain sailing. When we reached our first port, Tahiti, we asked each other, how can we sell this yacht and forget about the adventure? When we reached our final port, we asked, how can we do it all again? As you sail around the world, or even halfway, with your cross-functional team, what are you asking when you get to each destination?